right. So normally you guys catch us on Spotify, which this will be on Spotify as well. But today we're coming at you on video form for our USFL podcast. So to my right is Travis, my co-host for the USFL podcast. We do this every week throughout the season, do a review of the week's games, a preview of the next week's games, and then even some predictions, which it was kind of hit or miss this season as to how we did. But, it's hard to predict a new league where you haven't seen these teams play games yet. So it was definitely an experience. It's been a lot of fun chopping it up with you all season long. Travis, how are you doing today?
I'm doing good. Definitely been fun throughout the course of the season. Now that some of these players are getting signed and we're starting to see, how highly the NFL is valuing the USFL tape that's being put out there. Really interesting stuff to see, and then always excited for next year.
Agreed. So with the season over, we already did our championship review. If you have not caught that, it is up on Spotify right now. I apologize about the quality. That is 100% on me. I was driving while we were doing it, and it definitely affected the quality. I did some editing, but it just didn't come out as well as I would have thought. But with that being said, this episode will come out a lot better because I am not driving, as you can tell. So we're going to start with the players that have been signed by the NFL, and then we're going to get into some of the team needs and maybe even some draft talk if we have the time. But with that being said, we're going to start with Christian Sam, who was signed by the Dallas Cowboys. Christian Sam is a name that has bounced around the NFL for a couple seasons. He's been on practice squads. He's had some injury issues over the past, but it was kind of interesting to see him be the first player signed. He was actually cut from his original franchise in the USFL and then signed by the Breakers. And then he ended up being the first player signed by the NFL. What are your thoughts on that?
I think it's a really interesting signing and one that we definitely didn't anticipate. Like you said, he was cut by the Bandits and then signed off waivers to the Breakers. Ended up helping out their defense a little bit when healthy. And he still ended up putting up some fairly good numbers for the limited time that he played, but definitely not the first name that I thought would be signed.
Agreed. I mean, and as in terms of his numbers, 54 tackles, 8 tackles for a loss, and an interception, and he only played in 9 games. So really not a bad season by any stretch. And with that being said, it's actually surprising to see that he racked up those kind of numbers because of what happened with him being released from the Bandits and later going to the Breakers.
Definitely.
Would you like to go ahead and go with the next player?
Alrighty, so we'll lump in the next 2 players together because they both went to the Washington Commanders. They signed Channing Stribling, cornerback, and they also signed, sorry, I can't see his name anymore.
Dewan Neal,
yes. They signed 2 cornerbacks. Interesting. I definitely thought Channing Stribling would get signed. I wasn't as high on Neal. So what's your thoughts on the Commanders signing your boy Channing Stribling?
Well, I personally thought this was the signing that made the most sense out of everybody that was signed so far. I mean, Channing Stribling led the league with interceptions with 7, and I believe he only played in 7 games, if I'm not mistaken. So, I mean, he was a ball hawk this season. He's got NFL level size. He's 6'2", 190 pounds. So what more do you want in a cornerback at the NFL level?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think Dewan Neal is fighting an uphill battle in terms of making the roster. But I was looking at the roster the other day, and I think Channing Stribling has a shot at making the roster, and I hope he does. And, I want to see what he can do in the preseason. And hopefully he ends up making the final 53-man roster, or at least ends up on the practice squad.
Yeah, I think there's a really good chance that he makes the active roster. And if he's not on the practice squad, I would be quite surprised. Like we said, he's a guy who has a knack for being around the ball. It's definitely one of those things where I could see him maybe not necessarily playing cornerback in Washington's system. That is one thing that has kind of hampered him with the NFL in the past, is he ran like a 4.62 40 coming out of college. So he might end up playing like a free safety role and play like a little bit of slot corner when they need him to in the nickel defense, which with that being said, that's a role that's growing in the NFL, and it makes a lot of sense for him to fill it. So I definitely think that's something he could do, and that's a way for Washington to get him involved in multiple different ways.
Definitely. He might, yeah, like you said, he might have to play a little bit more like safety instead of corner. But I still think he's flexible enough and has enough versatility that he definitely has a good shot of making the roster, like you said.
Absolutely. And then the man you mentioned as well, DeJuan Neal, he was a guy I wasn't really familiar with coming out of the USFL. He was not a big time performer, but it comes to light that he had actually spent some time with Washington in 2019. So I wonder if he has some ties with the organization somewhere that got him back in there. But ultimately, I think it'll be interesting to see if he makes the roster. But like you said, he definitely has an uphill battle given that he was signed behind the best cornerback coming out of the USFL. So with that alone, I mean, he is definitely probably looking at the back end of the roster or practice squad spot at an absolute best anyway.
Definitely. And if he doesn't make it with the Commanders, hopefully maybe another team sees what they like and they pick him up for their practice squad. But, like you said, he's fighting an uphill battle right now.
Agreed. Moving on to the next players, let's go with the other team that signed 2 players. We have the Las Vegas Raiders. One of these guys had previous ties to the coach that now runs the Raiders, and that's wide receiver Isaiah Zuber. He spent some time with the New England Patriots. And then we also have cornerback Ike Brown from the New Orleans Breakers. What do you make of these 2 signings?
I mean, Ike Brown had a solid season with the Breakers, and Isaiah Zuber led the entire league in receiving touchdowns, I believe. Isaiah Zuber was one of those players who he was kind of stuck on a not great Houston Gamblers team, but he was one of the bright spots and quietly putting up really good numbers and having good games all year. And I think Isaiah Zuber, like you said, his ties with the coach, Josh McDaniels, he has a decent shot at possibly making this roster. I was looking at their roster the other day, and they are really striving for that 4th and 5th guy, that can come in and, either whether it's in the return game on special teams or just try to be a rotational piece for that offense.
Absolutely. So I'm going to play a quick interview. We might need to unmute our mics here in a second. Interview highlight of Isaiah Zuber catching a touchdown pass.
I take ball. Down. So we've seen the spread look. Now we get the power offensive look out of the Gamblers. Yeah, Lou. Hey, go. Dorson, play action. Pressure in his face again. Gets a throw into the air. Caught for the touchdown. Isaiah Zuber.
So that was obviously a very beautiful catch. You can kind of see why the Raiders see value in him as a player. He also led the team in kick return yards, so he has value as a return man as well. When you're talking about a 4th or 5th receiver on a depth chart, that dude's going to be playing special teams, and Zuber provides a tremendous value on special teams as well as the value of already knowing McDaniel's offense. So he actually has a really good shot of making this roster, in my personal opinion, as a 4th or 5th receiver. And I don't ultimately think we see him back in the USFL in 2023. And then, as you mentioned before, Ike Brown also had a very solid season with the Breakers. He had 2 interceptions, one that he returned, I believe, 98 yards for a touchdown. That actually was the difference in one of the games the Breakers won. And he's got solid size as well. I think he's 6 foot, 190 pounds. So he's definitely a NFL-sized cornerback. So both of these guys make a lot of sense. And the Raiders ultimately look like they paid close attention to the USFL in 2022.
Yeah, definitely. Josh McDaniel came out with a quote saying there's a lot of good players that played in the USFL, and he's already signed 2 of them. Ike Brown has a shot at making the roster. The Raiders have kind of cycled through DBs in recent years, and I saw they released a guy who I can't remember his name. They released a DB, and they signed Ike Brown. So I think he has a shot at making this roster also. It might be more of like a gunner on special teams or something like that to start off, but I could see him working his way, playing some preseason games, and, making this practice squad or, bottom end of the active roster.
Absolutely. So who would you like to talk about next with that being said?
Let's see here. How about we talk about both Pittsburgh players who has been signed so far?
Both Pittsburgh, as in the Steelers?
As in Carlo Kemp being signed
Okay, gotcha.
And yeah, we'll just start off with Carlo Kemp because he was the number 2 overall D lineman drafted whenever the Maulers took him in the second round of the USFL draft, and he ended up living up to that. I believe he finished the season with 5 sacks. He had a very good season. He didn't have as many sacks as like a Chris Odom or a Davin Bellamy, but he still was able to produce in a not amazing defense, which I'll get to that later. But him and Jeremiah Farms both were able to produce, and both ended up signing Carlo Kemp with the Chargers and Jeremiah Farms with the Patriots. What's your thoughts on both of them?
I was actually quite surprised to see Farms sign with the Patriots, mainly because of his college background. He played in a Power 5 conference school, so he's a small school guy, and a lot of those guys don't really get the looks in the NFL, but ultimately he played some arena ball, then he got into the USFL, and he played well, so he made it up to the NFL. I mean, that move right there, Jeremiah Farms, should be the number 1 most inspiring move for players looking to make the NFL, because this dude did not have an NFL level background prior to coming to the USFL, but he turned some heads, he turned the correct heads, and now he's signed by the Patriots. If there's one team that you want to be on if you're a young player that's versatile and can rush the passer, it's the Patriots. Bill Belichick will find a role for you if you can do it. With that being said, Carlo Kemp, I think, also lands in a very good spot. He's a guy who's had a couple opportunities in the NFL last season with the Denver Broncos and I believe the Green Bay Packers, if I'm not mistaken. Both of those teams run a 3-4 defense. The Chargers also run a 3-4 defense under Brandon Staley. So I expect he is going to be a valuable contributor. And I ultimately think that Kemp has one of the better chances to make an active roster out of camp right away. He is extremely young, and that's a big asset to have coming out of the USFL, having played professional ball against professional level players. I think this is only his second season, technically. So he was a rookie in 2021. So with that being said, there's still a lot of room for him to develop, especially receiving some of the best defensive coaching that he can from the Los Angeles Chargers coaching staff.
Definitely. I mean, they have a defensive-minded head coach, and he has plenty of time to develop, like you said. Super young. He's if he makes a roster, he very well could be sitting behind Khalil Mack, watching him and studying him, exactly what he does, and getting some rotational reps. And like you said, I think he does have one of the better chances of making an active roster out of all the people who signed so far.
Absolutely. Just out of curiosity, I obviously didn't watch the Maulers as close as you did this season. Did he play a true linebacker role, or was he playing a 4-3 defensive end?
He was more defensive end for the most part.
Okay, that's what I thought. I listed him as a defensive end in my most recent article, but I saw him listed as a linebacker a lot of places, and I'm like, man, he's 6'3", 280 pounds. That is not really a linebacker.
Yeah, I think they have him listed as like outside linebacker on a lot of things, but he played more edge rusher a lot.
Interesting. It'll be interesting to see how the Chargers use him. Maybe they do stand him up occasionally, because I mean he's athletic for sure.
Yeah, definitely.
It'll definitely be interesting. But one of my favorite players, my personal vote for most valuable player for the USFL as a whole, was Victor Bolden Jr. And Victor Bolden Jr. has been signed by the Arizona Cardinals. This is another guy who I think has a pretty solid shot of making the roster. Nobody uses more wide receivers in the NFL than the Cardinals. Cliff Kingsbury ultimately runs a form of the air raid offense, and with that, he employs more 5 wide receiver sets than any other team in the league. And Bolden, on top of that, can aid the return game in the punt return and kick return game. He had the most all-purpose yards in the USFL in 2022. And ultimately, he's a guy who's been in the NFL a couple times before. He was a punt returner, kick returner with San Francisco in 2018 and 2019. What are your thoughts on him being signed?
I mean, I love Victor Bolden being signed. Had a great year with the USFL. He was the championship MVP. one of the greatest all-around players that the league saw this season. And like you said, I think he has a solid shot at making the roster. There's a bunch of guys ahead of him that he's going to be battling out. But, the Cardinals, like you said, use 5 wide receivers a lot of the time. So he has a shot to make it, maybe being that 4th or 5th receiver in this offense or helping in the special teams, like you said. So interesting to see with what they do with him exactly, and interested to see his preseason.
I am as well. One of the big things that I thought was interesting about Bolden Jr. is that the Cardinals already have Rondale Moore, who was doing kick returns, punt returns, kind of that slot receiver. Maybe they're looking for him to take on a bigger offensive role, and with that, Bolden Jr. gets the opportunity to be a kick returner, punt returner.
Yeah, definitely. They could be looking to hike up his offensive role, so they might want somebody else to be a kick returner. They do still have Andy Isabella, so I think he's going to be fighting for that spot too. But it's definitely going to be a battle in training camp, and it's interesting to see how it will turn out for him.
Absolutely. You got to wonder about some of the decisions some of these guys made, like Bolden Jr. in particular. I think he does have a good shot there, but the Cardinals also employ some very good receivers at the top end of the depth chart. So he definitely has a battle ahead of him for sure.
Definitely. And I wonder if the DeAndre Hopkins suspension has anything to do with this. If maybe they just felt like they needed another guy to cycle in. And then if Hopkins, comes back, week 6 or week 7, maybe Bolden ends up getting moved down to the practice squad or ends up getting cut.
That could be interesting. Maybe he plays 6 games with the Cardinals and then ends up back with the Stallions in 2023.
Maybe. Or maybe another team. I think if Bolden gets cut, he has a good shot of at least getting signed to another team, whether it's on their practice squad or what, just to be given another opportunity.
Absolutely. That's one of the things that I wanted to talk about today is I ultimately think that even if we don't see numbers we expect of players signed by the end of the season or by the end of the offseason, we can expect some of these USFL players to be signed in season because they're in game shape and they're ready to go. So, I mean, if the NFL loses a player to injury and they need a guy to come in and play a couple games or add some depth, they might lean towards a USFL player who came straight out of a season and they know they're prepared to go right back into a game if that's what it takes, other than, learning the playbook real quick. But with that being said, do you want to go ahead and talk about your Pittsburgh Steelers signing?
Yeah, I mean, so we signed Doug Costin. He was a D tackle for the Stallions. He was an undrafted free agent that spent some time with the Jaguars. I believe he played in like 12 or 13 games with the Jaguars, his undrafted season. But I mean, he performed all right with the Jaguars. Unfortunately, he didn't parlay that into another opportunity in the NFL until now, but had a good season with the Stallions. And it's a tough battle, though, to be on that Steelers defensive line. We have so much depth at the position and so many guys that we've been cycling in, like Montavious Adams, Chris Wormley. We still have, oh man, now I'm blanking on all their names. But obviously he's going to be behind guys like Cam Hayward. We did release Isaiah Buggs, but he's still going to be behind like Larry Okunjobi that we signed, Carlos Davis. I already mentioned Montavious Adams. So there's a lot of guys that he's going to have to battle through. So he might be more of like a camp body for now, and then he hopefully makes a practice squad. But it's going to be, like I said, a really uphill battle for him.
Absolutely. I totally spaced that I was supposed to play some highlights for Victor Bolden Jr. So without further ado, here.
Plenty of time. Getting a score before half will be big as New Orleans gets it coming out of the half.
And an opportunity.
Plenty of time. Getting a score before half will be big as New Orleans gets it coming out of the half.
And an opportunity for Victor Bolden, who turns upfield across the 40 in full speed. Nobody's going to catch him. See you later.
Winner.
And that is exactly why we think that Victor Bolden Jr. is going to make an NFL roster, because there is always a team out there that needs a return man that can do exactly that. And Bolden Jr. can also aid your offense as well. But without further ado, I think there's only one man left on our list, unless I'm missing somebody.
Got two.
2. Okay, who was the other player I'm missing?
So the guy that I really want to talk about is tight end Sal Cannella, who the
That's
Packers
right.
signed. And I'm really excited for this move. And then I started looking at the roster a little bit, and I was like, oh, man. See, I was thinking he was definitely going to make this roster. But then looking at the roster, they still have Robert Tonyan. They still have Mercedes Lewis. They still have, I believe
Josiah DeGuara.
Yeah, they still have his name Dominic Daphne too, who played some time at tight end for them last year. So it's going to be a battle, but I do love Sal Cannella's upside. He has really good athleticism and good size for a tight end. So I love the athleticism and the upside, and I hope he ends up making this team because I think he could actually be a really good aid for that offense. And this is a team that maybe Dominic Daphne also played some fullback. So maybe he'll be more of a fullback, and then Sal Cannella will be more of the third tight end. Of course, Mercedes Lewis is more of a blocking tight end at this point and always really was. So if we see either a couple injuries or, just the right system, we could see Sal Cannella making a little bit of an impact in this offense.
Agreed. In fact, I would go one step further and say that there is a role for him to be had in this offense. We looked at the Packers earlier this offseason. They made a trade. They got rid of Devontae Adams. And in that trade, they tried to acquire the rights to Darren Waller, a very athletic former wide receiver turned tight end, not all that dissimilar from Sal Cannella. So I think they were looking for one of those guys that they can line up as a slot receiver. He can split out wide. He can play in line as a tight end. And he's a certain type of athlete that the Packers don't have on the roster. Tonyan is kind of your perfect middle ground, a guy who can catch the ball out of, he can serve as a blocker. He's solid in both fronts, but he's not necessarily spectacular as an athlete. Josiah DeGuara, he also played some fullback last season. He can play tight end. He can do a little bit of everything for your offense, but he's not necessarily the athlete that Sal Cannella is that can split out wide. So I think that Sal Cannella actually has a really good opportunity to make this roster as a third or fourth tight end, with Mercedes Lewis being the other guy on the roster. Daphne, I'm not really familiar with overall, but I could definitely see him being like a practice squad guy or end up being the odd man out. I ultimately think that Cannella is here for a reason. And I'm shocked that I forgot that he was signed, because I really think he has a good opportunity of making the Packers roster in 2022.
Definitely. I think he has to have a good preseason, and I don't anticipate him not to. So he's another one that I'm really excited to see how many preseason reps he gets and what he looks like in the NFL preseason coming up here.
Agreed. And it's kind of funny to see him go from arguably one of the most NFL experienced quarterbacks in the USFL with Kyle Sloter to one of the best quarterbacks in the NFL in Aaron Rodgers. So, I mean, he's definitely benefiting from solid quarterback play everywhere he goes so far.
Definitely.
Without that, or with that out of the way, we will move on to the New Jersey Generals quarterback that was signed, Luis Perez, and we're going to play some of his highlights real quick.
Perez forced out of the pocket towards the end zone. Caught. Yes, touchdown, Bowman. Perez, pump fake, going deep. He's got Turpin. Oh, dropped it in the basket. What a catch. What a throw. Outside linebacker trying to run down the field with Kevontae Turpin. It's an excellent throw. And by the way, good on Gooden for even being within a step of Kevontae Turpin.
See guys cheering for their team. Perez takes a hit as he lets it go deep down the field. What a throw by Perez.
All right, I'm not going to play the whole 3-minute highlight video they have up, but if you want to check that out, it is on the USFL YouTube page. Feel free to go check that out, as well as the Victor Bolden Jr. full highlight reel that is also on the USFL page on YouTube right after this. But with that being said, Luis Perez was one of the more efficient quarterbacks in the USFL in 2022, but he did actually not get drafted and was benched at one point. So what do you make of him being the first quarterback signed out of the USFL?
I think it's really interesting. I did not expect him to be the first quarterback signed, but looking into it deeper, I'm not surprised that much. He did have the best QBR in the entire league at the end of the season, and he had the highest completion percentage, I believe, at the end of the season. Definitely an efficient guy, and like you saw in those highlights, not scared to take a hit to deliver an accurate ball downfield. He's mobile enough. The only thing that we've knocked on him for is he doesn't have the biggest arm in the world, but he makes good decisions. He doesn't turn the ball over a whole lot, and he has really good general accuracy too.
Agreed. And honestly, we talked about it off camera a couple minutes ago. If you're looking for a backup NFL quarterback, which let's be real, nobody in the USFL is a starting caliber NFL quarterback at this particular moment. Otherwise, they wouldn't be in the USFL in the first place. But if you're looking for a backup quarterback, you could do a lot worse than Luis Perez. I mean, after what he did in the USFL, like you said, he was very efficient, completing over 70% of his passes on the season. That's very Drew Brees-like when it comes to accuracy. And you saw the ball placement in those highlights. He's not ever been an issue in terms of making bad decisions, throwing interceptions, putting your offense in a bad position. So in terms of backup quarterbacks, if you needed a guy to come in and start a short stretch of games, you could, there's not many better options coming out of the USFL than Luis Perez. I mean, there might be better athletes. There might be guys with stronger arms, but Luis Perez has a lot of professional experience behind him as well. He's probably one of the most developed quarterbacks in the USFL, having played in the Spring League, the XFL, the AAF, I think he was in as well, and then multiple different NFL teams throughout his career. So I think he's one of those guys that he's closer to the end of his development than he is at the beginning, which is most of the quarterbacks in the USFL currently.
Yeah, definitely. If you're getting a player like Luis Perez, like you said, nobody here is a day one starter, but Luis Perez can help out, in the film room. He can help out your younger quarterbacks that you have on the roster in terms of developing. And if you need him to come in a pinch to, keep you competitive a game or two, he's a guy who's not going to lose you these games.
Absolutely. And I mean, if you're talking about a roster that wants competitive quarterback play on a week in, week out basis, it's the Rams. I mean, they obviously just won the Super Bowl. They think they can contend again in 2022. So with that being said, they're not going to want to drop off at quarterback should Stafford get injured, although Stafford has shown an ability to play through injury throughout his career. But that ends up being a perfect segue to the next man I want to talk about very briefly, because I don't have confirmation on this yet, but Kyle Sloter has been removed from USFL rosters and stat sheets. That being said, the only reason this has been happening so far has been these players are signed by the NFL. So the USFL is apparently scrubbing them from their pages. Kyle Sloter has been removed. He just had a workout with the Jacksonville Jaguars a couple days ago. He's got one of the most decorated NFL resumes in terms of any quarterback coming out of the USFL. He spent time with Denver, Minnesota, and a couple other teams throughout his career as well. So I ultimately expect an announcement today that Kyle Sloter has been signed by the Jacksonville Jaguars and former head coach of the Philadelphia Eagles, Doug Peterson.
And I think if he gets signed to the Jaguars, I think that's a great move by the Jaguars. Obviously, a very young quarterback. Kyle Sloter's been around the block everywhere. And this is a guy who can help you, help you in the film room. Like I was saying earlier about Luis Perez, is a guy who can help your younger quarterbacks develop and, show them how they might need to carry themselves and how they should be studying film and, really help with their progression, even though he would probably be the third or maybe the second string. I think they have CJ Beathard as their second string right now, but he could be battling for a backup quarterback spot.
Agreed. And I think Beathard he's a solid backup, but I wouldn't say that he's got that position cemented by any stretch. So if Sloter comes in and balls out and looks healthy, which is a big issue after all the injuries he suffered this season, there's a really good opportunity for him to ultimately make his way onto that roster in Jacksonville.
Definitely.
With that being said, why don't we go ahead and move on to team needs, and we'll have to probably wait until our next episode for the USFL to talk about the draft and stuff like that as we get more information.
Okay.
Do you want to start?
Sure, I'll take it away. So I chose the North Division, and the teams in the North are, of course, the Pittsburgh Maulers, the Michigan Panthers, the New Jersey Generals, and the Philadelphia Stars. And Three of these teams have a lot of things in common. Specifically, the Stars, the Panthers, and the Maulers all struggled on the defensive side of the ball at courses through this year. If you look at the team stats, these are the bottom three teams in terms of defense when you're talking about points allowed. The Maulers and Panthers are the two worst defensive teams. They allowed the most points. They had the same amount of allowed points through the course of the year. And then Philadelphia had, was right behind them. So really what they need to work on is just defense for all three of these teams specifically. Of course, the Stars lost their number one corner, and the Maulers have lost two of their starting D linemen. So they're going to have to shore up, these certain positional groups. Some teams need a little bit different things than others. But in general, that's really what these three teams need. And for the North as a whole needs to get better because the USFL has posted already that the South had a winning record over North teams. So the North as a whole can improve also.
Agreed. I mean, the South, it was kind of tough to find needs for all these teams. But with that being said, I mean, with the New Orleans Breakers, I picked safety, offensive line, and quarterback, given the fact that I think Kyle Sloter might be leaving. Offensive line, I mean, they let Kyle Sloter get beat up. At times they couldn't run the ball. It just makes a lot of sense to address that position. Safety, I think they need some better athletes outside of a couple guys that are on the roster. With the Bandits, I picked running back, quarterback, and secondary. People are probably going to be surprised to see quarterback on this list, but I think the backups leave something to be desired. Neither one of those guys have very much professional experience, so they kind of scare me if they were to need to start some games for the Bandits. It would be kind of a scary proposition to see them in. Running back, we talked about it all season long. Te'amu led the team in rushing and passing. And you just can't allow that. There's no way that this guy can carry the offense like that on a week in, week out basis. Secondary was my third pick. That's because Tampa Bay needs to get some ball hawks. One of the big things that they did to not help Te'amu was the fact that they only created 5 interceptions all season long. 2 or 3 of those came from the linebacker position, and only 2 of them came from the secondary, 1 from a safety and 1 from a cornerback. So outside of Quentin Meeks and Anthony Siafi, maybe. They really don't have anybody in that secondary that can stand up. Birmingham, they need wide receiver help. We saw multiple times this season where injuries just sapped everybody off of the roster. We saw Alex Magoo line up as a wide receiver at times. Defensive tackle, they lost Doug Costin. Willie Yarbury has gotten some looks, so he could be leaving soon. And then defensive end, Jonathan Newsom also has had some interest by the NFL. Linebacker, it hasn't happened yet, but I expect DeMarcus Gates to get signed by the NFL. He had an amazing season, 62 tackles, 6.5 sacks, and an interception. So we'll see, but ultimately I think they're going to need to add some depth there. Houston, this one was fairly easy. Quarterback is a position they need to address. Wide receiver and punter. So punter might be kind of surprising for people, but they failed the flip field position quite often, and I think that's a big reason why we saw a lot of close losses with Houston. 55.4% of the time was all that he was able to convert in terms of getting punts inside the 20 or touchbacks. So if you're giving teams better field position than the 20 to start drives, you're putting your defense behind the ball on a play-in, play-out basis, and it's very difficult to succeed. They lost their top receiver, Isaiah Zuber, and then quarterback was spotty at best from both guys all season long, so it's a question of which guy is going to shake out as the starter next season.
Definitely.
Any arguments there?
I don't have any arguments there. The Tampa Bay quarterback thing, like you said, behind Te'amu, I'm not impressed with anybody. We'll see if Te'amu is still in the league or not, or if he ends up, getting signed soon, which I think he has a good shot of, being on someone's practice squad. He was on somebody's practice squad last year for, big chunks of the year. So we'll see if he ends up coming back to the USFL. But if he doesn't, I think quarterback is definitely a huge need for them, because we saw the amount of games they won whenever Jordan Talmo had the entire team on his back, essentially. And if they don't have that, it could get way worse. So, I think that's a really good analysis there by you.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Yeah, I mean, it was, like I said, there were some teams that were a little tough. Birmingham in particular was a little tough to find needs for them. But, I mean, each one of these teams, they still have some holes. The North teams, there are several holes for most of them. My Stars in particular are going to have a lot of work to do this offseason. But with all that being said, when do you think we start seeing players be signed to USFL rosters for the 2023 season?
I'm thinking probably like we've already spoke about after the XFL draft, which I believe is taking place in November. So maybe something like a December or maybe a January. Their season didn't start till April last year, so maybe more of like a January. By then, a lot of the XFL rosters are rounding out, and they'll have a better grasp of the free agents. So I would say probably around January is whenever they're really shoring up your USFL rosters.
That would make a lot of sense. I mean, when you think about it, the NFL season should be ending in January or late December. So with that being said, I would expect that a lot of those guys are starting to get their futures deals from the practice squad, et cetera, and you're starting to figure out which guys aren't going to be back with the NFL. And then I expect the USFL to jump all over those guys and try to get them over to the USFL before the XFL can. But it should be extremely interesting after the XFL draft to see what's left out there from all the guys who went to the showcases and stuff, and see if the USFL essentially just moves down the list and signs the best players of the rest, or how it all shakes out. If some of these guys ultimately opt to go to the USFL because they have a better opportunity to play, or there's less questions. I mean, there's so much to be answered with all these different leagues popping up. I mean, with the USFL, the XFL, the MLFB all expecting to occupy the spring season next year, I mean, there's going to be a huge competition for talent.
Definitely. I mean, yeah, like you said, everybody, of course, is striving for that XFL or for the NFL dream, but you also have all these other places that are trying to take talent too. The Indoor Football League, the XFL, the USFL, the MLFB, all these other places, all these other opportunities for players to go. And it's going to be interesting to see, who decides really to go where. And like you sent me an article the other day of the Ohio State kicker, I believe, choosing to pursue a chance with a MLFB team instead of going back to Ohio State. We could see stuff like that where players might be not loving their college, and instead of entering the transfer portal, they say, hey, I got a shot to play in the XFL or the USFL or the MLFB or wherever it might be.
Exactly. In fact, if I'm the XFL, the USFL, the MLFB, something like that, I'm calling up every one of those guys in that transfer portal. Hey, I see you are not happy where you're at. Do you want to come get paid to play football? Maybe take online classes in your spare time? Yada, 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 whatever. Guys on the transfer portal most likely are not out there making millions off their name and likeness. All these people think that just because that is no longer outlawed by the NCAA, that every one of these guys has sponsorship deals from somebody. That's not the case. Not every player is well known. Not every player is, a recognizable name or a recognizable face. So there's not going to be name and likeness deals for everybody. And with that being said, these guys aren't making money. They're living off scholarships, or they're not getting scholarships and they're paying their way through school. I've heard multiple players on this channel talk about it, that they went into the transfer portal and their opportunities just weren't there, and they ended up in the professional world because of that. And I would expect more of that to happen in the future, because the XFL, the USFL, the MLFB, they're going to have to get creative to continue bringing talent to their league, because the pay is what it is. So when you look at the XFL is going to offer somewhere between $5,000 to $6,500 a week, with the quarterbacks expected to be somewhere around $10,000. And then USFL, same thing. They're about $4,500 a week to $5,500 a week. Quarterbacks a little bit higher. MLFB is $2,000 a week with $500 win bonuses. So you automatically have a tier of which league's going to shake out with which players want to go there. Obviously, best players are going to go where the most money's at, unless they see a better opportunity to start in the USFL or the MLFB. But with that being said, there's going to be a lot of these guys that start considering all these opportunities because there's going to be a lot more jobs available that pay coming right out of college. So, I mean, I'm fairly interested to see how much of that we see in the future.
Definitely. I'm really excited to see what these USFL teams look like in season 2, if they're anything recognizable of their season 1 teams, how many players are going to stick around, and what these teams are exactly going to look like, because that's how you draw more interest and more fans. If you have a constant base, essentially, because not all of your players are going to get signed by the NFL. So you're going to still hold some players, and it's really interesting to see, how these teams handle that. Agreed.
If you had to guess, how many players do you think ultimately get signed out of the USFL to the NFL by the end of the season?
What are we at, 11 right now?
Yeah.
I think it's going to be something similar to the XFL in 2020. I want to say the XFL had around like 25 to 30. Not all of them made rosters, of course, but probably something in that ballpark with like a 20, something like that, I would think.
I could see that. So after the XFL in 2020, we saw a couple guys stick, specifically with the Panthers, actually, with PJ Walker, Kenny Robinson, and Donald Parham with the Chargers as well. Do you see anybody sticking long-term in the NFL out of the USFL class so far?
Out of the guys who've signed right now, Sal Cannella is a big one that I like. Even if it's not necessarily sticking with the with the Packers, but I still think there's other teams that he could go to if he would to get cut that he could make an impact on. Depending on how they use players like Victor Bolden and Isaiah Zuber, they could cement, the return positions or cement a slot position for these teams. And of course, like we mentioned earlier, Carlo Kemp. That's really the guys who I'm seeing who, whenever we're talking about the USFL and, a year or 2 years, these are the players that I could see still might be on NFL rosters.
Agreed. What would be kind of funny, and I know this is technically against the rules, but it'd be kind of interesting to see like NFL teams, obviously we would never really know, publicly, but it would be kind of interesting to see like NFL scouts and teams kind of push some of these players that need film against better competition in college to like the USFL, the XFL, MLFB, whatever it would be, like guys out of the Division II level, hey, we like what we see. You guys have traits, but we need to see you against a better level of competition. Why don't you go to the USFL for a year? Why don't you go to the XFL for a year? And then, if we like what we see, we'll sign you for our following NFL season. So we're not going to draft you this upcoming draft season, but if you prove yourself, you're going to be on the team, or we're going to take a look at you for the following season. I could see a lot of that happening. Obviously, again, it's against the rules. The NFL can't technically do that. They can't technically tell a kid to leave school to go to a professional opportunity, but it would be interesting to see more of that in the future.
Definitely. That's a guy like Donald Parham with the XFL. I went to a Division II school in Florida and ended up having a really good season with the XFL, and that's how he got more eyes on him. And he's still with the Chargers now. And that's a guy, too, like for the USFL, like a Randy Satterfield who went to a Division III school, and he ended up having some good games with the USFL to get some looks. I don't think he's going to get signed this year, but next year, of course, if there's more improvement and, more film, that can only increase your chances of getting signed.
Exactly. And I think that's actually kind of exactly what happened with Carlo Kemp. If I'm not mistaken, he was from Florida International University. And with that being said, that's a more prominent school than what we're talking about. I think it's still Division I, but it's still not, it's not Notre Dame or it's not USC or, these schools that are putting players in the league every year. So I think that he needed a couple more looks, and he got that opportunity with USFL. And I really think that he's got a great opportunity to land on the active roster for the Chargers this season.
Definitely.
But with all that being said, I'm pretty much out of stuff to talk about for this episode. If you are,
We can run over a couple players who might be getting workouts here soon,
oh yeah, that's right.
like some of the big ones, like Kevontae Turpin had a workout with the Dallas Cowboys. That would be a really interesting move that I would love to see. And who's some other guys that have been getting big time workouts?
Actually, competition for Kevontae Turpin in Dallas is Maurice Alexander, my guy off the Philadelphia Stars there. Yeah, he's also a kick returner wide receiver type. So him and Turpin are actually competing for the same roster spot. Man, we talked about Kyle Sloter, who got an opportunity. We talked about Willie Arbery, Jonathan Newsom, who both got tryouts. There's some more. I'm just blanking them off the top of my head.
Did Darius Victor get any workouts yet?
Yes, New Orleans.
With the Saints, yes.
He actually has a
perfect
history
move, I
there
think,
too.
for him. Yeah, I think Darius Victor to the Saints would be a perfect move because I've compared him in the during the season to Mark Ingram, and I think that would just be a perfect fit for him down there, especially if we see any form of suspension or missed games by Alvin Kamara. I think that'd be a perfect spot there for him.
That's a great point. With Alvin Kamara possibly being suspended, why not bring in a guy who's a veteran like Victor? And Victor can do a lot of the same things Kamara can. I mean, he can catch the ball out of the backfield. He's a kick returner, punt returner guy. He can also run between the tackles like Kamara does, being a smaller, compact back. So that makes a lot of sense. And like I said, he's already got a background with the Saints. I think he tried out with them originally as an undrafted free agent and spent some time there in training camp, but I don't think he ultimately made the active roster at any point.
Okay.
And then I mentioned DeMarcus Gates. I'm shocked he hasn't gotten any calls or any public calls yet, but I really expect him to get an opportunity. I think he's only 26, so he's definitely not too old for the NFL camps by any stretch.
No, he's a guy who I expect to get signed, here pretty soon, probably in the next week or so. It wouldn't surprise me if we found out that he had, 2 or 3 other teams talking to him, trying to decide on maybe a price, what team might be paying what. Like we saw with a PJ Walker, who out of the XFL had a offer from the Seahawks, from the Cardinals, and from the Panthers, and he chose to go with the Panthers because he's playing with his former head coach, Matt Rule. So there's a couple guys who I'm interested to hear if they do have multiple offers and what team they decide to go with too.
Man, how different would the NFL landscape be right now if PJ Walker was in Seattle?
See, me and a friend was talking the other day, and I said, if PJ Walker gets cut because now he is the fourth quarterback on their roster, probably, I think he does not have a bad chance at starting in Seattle.
No. Are you kidding? I would bring him in a heartbeat to give him a shot. I mean, what do you lose? I mean, 100%. I don't even. God, their quarterback room scares the hell out of me. Like, I would not want to be a Seattle Seahawks fan right now. Drew Lock and Geno Smith. Are you kidding me? Talk about the 2 worst second-round picks in like the last decade.
Yeah, like if I had PJ Walker in that situation, if I was the coach, he's probably my day one starter. Between Drew Lock, Geno Smith, Jacob Easton, he's probably my day one starter. So I think if I was in the Seahawks, I'd maybe be either hoping he gets cut or trying to incentivize it a little bit. But
yeah, what do you have to lose by shipping the Panthers a 7th round pick in 2024 or something like that?
Exactly. Just to make sure you get him and make sure he doesn't go to another team.
Exactly. Even if he doesn't make the roster, you're not losing much. I mean, there's different ways that you can make that happen. I think it makes a lot of sense for Seattle, especially given that I did not know they had previous interest in him. It's the same regime.
Yeah, it's still the same regime. I believe, I'm not sure if I'm 100% correct on this, but I feel like I remember this happening whenever PJ got signed. I believe the Seahawks offered him more money than the Panthers. But Walker wanted to play with his former college coach, so he chose the Panthers instead. And of course, the Seahawks at the time had Russell Wilson, so he saw no chance of playing. So he went with the Panthers, but now he has a good chance of playing with the Seahawks. So I think that'd be a great move, honestly.
No doubt. That would be extremely interesting. I mean, I could totally see that. That would be That'd be probably the best move for him. I mean, a lot of speculation that he might end up back in the XFL in 2023, but I think he's built some NFL momentum. So I think he's kind of at that level to stay now. I could be wrong though.
See, I feel that too. I feel like he's proven himself to be, a good at least number 2 quarterback in the NFL now. So I don't see him going back to the XFL for the next season. Maybe if he does go to another team and gets cut, and maybe we'll see him back there in like a year or in like 2 years or something. But I think as of right now, he has a good enough resume to stay on NFL rosters for the next coming years.
Agreed. I actually think Jacob Eason's got a pretty good shot to start there. He's young enough that he's still got upside, but we'll see. That's going to be a big question to answer for the NFL season for sure.
Definitely. We'll see how that all turns out, and I think that's pretty much everything we needed to cover. Don't want to go on too much of an XFL tangent on the USFL show, but that'll be next week or something that we'll talk about XFL in depth.
Absolutely. So if you enjoyed this episode, definitely tune in next time we do our XFL episode. We were going to do them both together, and then it was like a flood of information from the USFL started, and it was guy after guy after guy starting to get signed. And we actually spent over a half an hour talking about just the 11 guys that got signed. So it's probably a good thing that we split this into 2 episodes for sure.
Definitely.
But with that being said, man, I really appreciate you coming on again, and I look forward to next weekend.
Definitely. Always fun. Excited for the XFL news that's coming out today. And, we'll talk about that next week.
Absolutely. If you are a football fan, today is a great day. MLFB is holding a scrimmage that's going to be live broadcast on YouTube, completely free to watch. IFL has their final playoff game for this weekend today at, I believe, 4:05 Mountain Time, so 6:05 Eastern Time. And then the XFL is announcing teams and supposedly venues, or cities and venues, not teams yet, supposedly. We'll see, though. But they're doing that live as well. If you want to catch that and all the information that comes out, you can catch that on the Markcast on YouTube. That is actually one of my coworkers at the XFL News Hub. He paid his own dime to go down to Dallas after being in the Arizona showcase as well to catch all this information. So we've got guys everywhere from XFL News Hub right now trying to cover the XFL in a unique way that nobody else can. So definitely stick with XFL News Hub, the Markcast, and this channel, and we'll bring you all the breaking news we can as the XFL gives us more information down the line.
Definitely. It's been fun like it always is, and we'll see you next week.
Absolutely. Have a good afternoon.
Yep.